Jamil, wait.
There we are.
Are we on? We're not. Oh,
not yet. I'm waiting for him to.
No, he says you're on.
Oh, hi. We're on. Welcome to our audience. This is the Carter Center Forum on Human Rights, where we will be discussing today a very pertinent topic, how to protect human rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that in many countries and cities around the world, people and governments are struggling to address this unprecedented global pandemic. And we can see that some cities and countries are handling it in a manner that is consistent with democratic ideals. And we also see that some states and governments from the local to the national level are in fact expanding, broadening the powers that they hold in a way that is not consistent with human rights. And we really want to delve into that. And we're really honored and pleased to have two experts with us today that are going to be helping us address this question. First, of course, welcome to the Carter Center Forum on Human Rights. The Carter Center is committed to the advancement of human rights and democracy worldwide. Former President Jimmy Carter has been asking us at the Carter Center increasingly in recent years to promote the ideals of human rights and democracy worldwide through our activities and through this web platform. We are committed especially to the important and vital and sometimes dangerous work of human rights defenders and organizations that are locally based, that face especially difficult circumstances and even risks to their lives to protect and advance human rights. Last October, President Carter hosted our Human Rights Defenders Forum and asked us to really amplify this work. And so this program and future programs are devoted to this commitment. So first, today's program, I just want to give you a brief outline of what we're going to discuss. We're going to address what are the international human rights standards, what must governments do in times of states of emergency, what are they allowed to do on a temporary basis to protect the public health of people, and what are they not allowed to do under international human rights law, which they have all signed up to through various UN treaties, human rights treaties. Our speakers today will address the question of international standards, and they will also give us some specific examples of what is happening in different contexts, globally and in the United States. So please stay tuned for this entire discussion. You won't be disappointed. There'll be lots of interesting opportunities to learn, but also to comment and join in the discussion. If you would like to join the discussion, please sign up for an account on this web platform. This is not a social media platform. It's a dedicated platform to these topics. And in order to comment, we require that folks sign up so that we can effectively moderate the discussion. So our first objective today really is to identify some successes on how local human rights defenders and organizations are pushing back against this abuse of power that we see in some contexts. There are some effective advocacy and campaigning going on and work by courageous human rights activists and organizations. But our second objective, and we want to really spend most of our time on this idea, is we really want to talk about the world we want to see when this pandemic is over. How can we take this time of reflection and community building through this kind of platform and from our own private homes and spaces? How can we really think together about strengthening the human rights idea? After all, after World War II, it was the human rights idea that all the governments of the world came together to say, after a time of great cataclysm, after the Second World War, that human rights, the human-centered economy, the human-centered polity, human well-being should be at the center of how we organize our societies. And we have a new opportunity right now to think about this again and to recommit ourselves to this idea that human beings and human well-being can be at the center of how we organize our societies. So I'd like to begin with Hadar Harris, who is an international human rights attorney, currently executive director of the Student Press Law Center, supporting and defending First Amendment and freedom of expression rights of student journalists. Prior to that, for 13 years, Hadar was the executive director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at American University, Washington College of Law. And she has served on the board of directors of Amnesty International, as well as other human rights organizations around the world. Hadar, can you outline for us what are the international obligations that governments have? And then tell us some examples of some of the problems that you're seeing around the world right now.
Sure. Thanks, Karin. And thank you to the Carter Center for convening this really important conversation. There have been a lot of conversations that have been going on over the last weeks, kind of trying to flesh out some of these issues and trying to think about how you deal with a real public health pandemic and crisis at the same time that you're making sure that you're protecting rights on a whole variety of different levels. When I think about this, I think about the fact that we have both a reactive and a proactive mandate at this moment, and it's important that we focus on both of them. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism recently said that there were two pandemics going on, the health pandemic and then a pandemic of emergency responses. And so as we are looking at how we talk about this, we often talk about civil and political rights in terms of states of emergencies. And yet we fundamentally have to look at this crisis as one that integrates the indivisible pieces of human rights, both social and economic and cultural, as well as civil and political. You know, as we start to talk about what's going on in the world today, we can look to one of the resources that I think you have up on the blog and on the website, which is a civil liberties tracker that ICNL has put together that shows that 76 countries have already put out emergency declarations. 19 countries have measures that affect freedom of expression, and 84 countries have measures that are affecting the right to assembly. So when we talk about that, we have to think a little bit about the framework that encompasses all of that. When we talk about a state of emergency, which is part of the discussion and part of that international legal framework that we talk about, and I think Jamil's going to talk about this maybe a little bit more, we look to the International Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are real constraints around the framework for what a state of emergency is. It needs to be necessary. It needs to be based in law. It needs to be proportionate. It needs to be in no way discriminatory, and it needs to be time bound, which means that any of these emergency declarations that countries are putting into place, and as I just said, at least 76 countries have put emergency declarations into place, if not formal states of emergency. They need to be clear and they need to adhere to these different kinds of standards. That's all very legalistic. But what it basically says is it can't go on forever. It has to be proportionate. It has to be necessary and really based in the need for the particular state of emergency. And it also has to be transparent and bound to international oversight, which the UN and various fora can look at what's happening in a particular country. So what we're seeing in different countries around the world is sometimes there are states of emergency being declared, but they're not being necessarily declared within the legal framework and the legal structures of the UN or even regional human rights bodies. And we can get back to that later on in our conversation. But we also are seeing emergency measures being taken that may not be practical and may really be infringing on the rights of others. So to be really specific about cases. We're seeing the targeting of whistleblowers. When this pandemic began, you had doctors and nurses and journalists in China who were sounding the alarm, saying there's a real problem here. And at the same time, you were seeing a lot of lack of transparency and disinformation coming from the Chinese government, another trend that we're seeing.
And what happened to those nurses and doctors, the whistleblowers? What happened to them?
Some of them have disappeared. Many of them have been arrested. Some of them have died because they actually contracted the virus. One of the emergency room doctors, early on died of the virus in China. But it's not only in China. It's also been in Brazil and in Egypt and in Turkey, all of whom have targeted journalists and physicians and healthcare workers and human rights defenders for calling the pandemic what it is and for exposing the abuses that have been going on. So it's of tremendous concern that whistleblowers have been targeted. The limitations on freedom of expression, the lack of transparency that I mentioned a moment ago, related to the free flow of information about what exactly is happening in particular countries, like in not just in China, but also in Russia, also in Turkmenistan, which had kind of this glorious moment of you can't say coronavirus, you can't use the word COVID-19. And that was actionable if you actually even talk about it in Turkmenistan. You have draconian measures that are being adopted around the world by different governments talking about restricting misinformation about the virus. In Egypt, websites are being blocked. In Armenia, Cambodia, South Africa, even in Botswana, where there have been measures put in place and folks have been arrested for disrespecting the government or in making offensive statements to the government that is being wrapped into legislation around misinformation around the coronavirus. It's very troubling and very disturbing. At the same time, you have countries that have suspended operation of all print newspapers, like Morocco and Oman, both of which have suspended all print newspapers.
So these responses from government are specifically for people who are attempting to shed light on the situation of the virus. So it's very, but they're, are they expanding, are they using that as an excuse? Do you see that happening?
Oh yeah, I mean,
okay.
I think that it's not just, the measures, as we said, states of emergency or emergency measures have to be pretty narrowly construed and they need to be proportionate. They need to be clear and necessary. Well, if you have a law that says that you can't spread any kind of disinformation or misinformation about either government efforts or anything having to do with the virus, that opens the door to a very wide and vague interpretation of anybody who's saying anything against the government generally.
Right.
And we've seen that in really extreme cases, like in the Philippines, where Duterte has basically put a shoot to kill order in effect for the military there and the police there, where they've arrested over 17,000 people related to violations of curfew orders and the lockdown, but also because they're gathering or assembling in some ways to try to either pass information about the pandemic, either protest against what is happening within the country, or maybe they actually don't even have a place to go because they have no safe social isolation homes to be able to go to. So these are being used opportunistically in a lot of ways. One last point that I would make, there are lots of points to make, is that use of incarceration. And on one hand, and I know Jamil's going to talk about it in a moment, there's a real push to try to release folks from conditions of confinement globally in overcrowded prisons, as well as in the United States, the most overly incarcerated country in the world. But using the example of Turkey, which is a pretty stark example, Turkey just last week passed a law that said that they would release a third of the prison population because of overcrowding and to try to alleviate the impact of the virus on folks who were incarcerated. But there is a very serious concern that this specifically excludes anyone who's in pretrial detention or has been convicted of terrorism offenses. And if you know what's going on in Turkey today, that's being used very specifically to crack down on journalists or opposition party leaders and academics as well. And so it's of tremendous concern that many of the longtime political prisoners who've been swept up in the sweeps that have been going on in Turkey over the last few years are not eligible to be released because of this kind of exclusion and this opportunistic using of keeping people locked up, keeping prominent human rights defenders locked up when others are being released to try to protect them from the virus. So that's a lot. We haven't even touched on surveillance. We haven't touched on the opportunistic expansion of other kinds of laws or the cultural shifts and dangers of normalizing what are really not normal emergency laws that are being adopted in other places. Hopefully we'll get to that in a little bit.
Let's get to that. Jamil Dakwar, I'd like to introduce you to our audience. Jamil is the director of the ACLU's Human Rights Program. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2004, he worked at Human Rights Watch, and before moving to the United States was a senior attorney with Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. He is an adjunct professor at Hunter College and Bard College. Jamil, maybe you could pick up some of the discussion around international law if you want to. What are some of the restrictions that we need to be noticing or knowing about and noticing that when they're being abused or violated? And then give us some of the areas of concern that you have about what's going on, either just in the US, but also globally as well, if you wish. Jamil, you're on mute. If you want to unmute your.
Yes, thank you so much for having this conversation and for the Carter Center to lead this forum and to I hopefully will hear more voices in the next few weeks and months from all over the world and here from the United States. I think that the importance of linking both what's happening in the United States to the rest of the world is so essential, so that it will not look like we're just looking outside our borders because some countries, are abusing human rights in a way that is much more severe, much more dangerous than we're seeing in our country. But back to I think that Hadar has raised a lot of really important questions. And one thing I wanted to start off with is that for many communities, and certainly for advocates and defenders in the United States, have been operating under a situation of crisis as far as human rights. Mm-hmm. And obviously that applies to many situations in the world, but I wanted to be more specific in the United States because if you look at the criminal legal system, right, in the way that we mass incarcerate people, where you have nearly 700,000 people in pre-trial detention, mm-hmm. Where you have 10 million people who are admitted to jail prison system every year. In terms of like the notion of how many people are being incarcerated in the United States, more than 2.3 million people as a whole are incarcerated in the United States. Adding to that, the incarceration that happens in the immigration context, in the detention of migrants, asylum seekers. And in all of these settings, detention facilities, whether it's in the criminal legal system or the immigration detention system, we've seen over the years, and it's not only the Trump era, although the Trump administration had made things much worse and more dangerous to people who were subject to incarceration. We have seen that is a long-standing problem that we've had. So I think now when we have a pandemic and a serious public health crisis, the question is, what do we do now when we have those situations where people are really locked in and trapped in essentially our death traps, where they are, there's no way for them to be able to do practice social distancing. They don't have any access to the hygienes, the very basic hygiene elements of soap, the things that we take for granted outside the confines of detention, right? So there's a lot of that has happened before the pandemic. And so the pandemic, I think, gave the world has showed there's, unfortunately, in a very tragic way, some of the things that we should do regardless of a pandemic. Why people should be in detention when we know that they don't pose any threat or there's no threat to public safety. That there's really a lot of the decisions that got us to where we are not based on public health reasons, are not based on any real good justifications for having people suffer and being locked behind bars, whether it is immigrants or people who are in the criminal legal system. So I think that is how a lot of the advocates and human rights defenders are now looking at it, not just in the way of we have to make sure that we get as many people out of those cramped, crowded spaces to make sure that they are not going to be infected, they're not going to infect or be infected by the prison guards, by CBP, by the Border Patrol agents that are apprehending people at the borders, or ICE agents who are continuing to, for some period of time, continue to do raids and detain people and insist of keeping people in detention, even after court orders. We had a case just last few days in Pennsylvania, where the ACLU of Pennsylvania, with the ACLU National and other partners have represented people who are older immigrants who were in detention, people who are at risk of infected by the virus because of their pre-existing condition, medical condition, underlying condition. And even though the judge ordered them released, there were, and then some of the people were out of prison, and then some of the individuals who were just waiting for someone from their family to pick them up. The government still tried to appeal the decision and to get those people back in prison, back in detention. The inhumanity that we're seeing in that side of the that is really remarkably something that we can't accept, and we should really also talk about how to resist that. But at the same time, I think that
Jamil, can I ask you a question about that? Because can you talk about what the violation of international standards of human rights are at work here? Because it seems that the state is obligated to provide, if someone is incarcerated, if someone is detained for any given purpose, there are certain obligations that the government has. Now, if they are, by the very nature of detaining someone and putting someone in close confinement with others, are threatening their very lives. There seems to be many violations going on here. I mean, one case that I heard of in New York State, where a young man who was arrested and put in detention because of he didn't have cash bail, died from the virus for a minor offense. And he never was able to even see a judge. He was thrown into confinement. So can you talk about, the violations of human rights that pertain to this problem?
Well, I think that we start with, first of all, the human dignity of all people, regardless whether they are detained or not detained, whatever the status, they deserve basic human rights and the protection of their human dignity, particularly their ability to protect their life, their physical integrity, their everything that needs for them to defend them as human beings. The second thing is the principle of non-discrimination. But before that, I would want to incarceration should not be the first resort, should not be the first option.
Exactly.
Alternative to detention is a key principle in the human rights framework, that governments at all levels should not be the first thing to do is to get people behind bars. So that is important to maintain or look at who should be in the first place detained and what are conditions. And so there's all the things that were mentioned earlier around proportionality and necessity, right? And is it necessary to hold people? Is it proportionate for whatever they are being accused or being held for, whether it's a civil violation or it's a criminal violation of the law? what is the particular measure that is taken in order to protect these other interests of the state, public safety, public order. Sometimes they raise national security, etc. So I think that it's important to put those, and then the non-discrimination, or a lot of ways that our system, particularly in the United States, but also in other places where the criminal legal system is really flawed and has been a continuation of a racist, structural racism has been impacting people, not because they are different in many ways, just because they are belong to a particular a group of people, particularly people of color in the United States. So the idea that how do we make sure that people, even when they are in detention, let's assume that there's a justified reason to keep people in detention, then there are all the detention humane conditions that need to be provided. We've had, luckily, we now have a revised and updated international rules as part of the Nelson Mandela rules on the detention or the minimum standard of the treatment of prisoners. Those standards were adopted in the 1950s and were updated and revised by the UN General Assembly in 2015. And the United States, as many other countries, accepted them, adopted them, and even championed them, and said these are the rules that we need to adopt. And these rules specifically talk about issues of hygiene, issues of how to make sure that the prisoners are not protected from infections, from diseases, and protection from all kinds of things that could put them at risk, and particularly from cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment and torture, obviously. So there is a whole host of laws and specific rules that are more directed to correctional facilities. Unfortunately, not all of those rules are upheld and practiced and implemented. That's one of the struggles and the challenges that we have. But what we're seeing now is that because of the fact that there's kind of I think the public health justification led by experts who published, and that's one thing that I want to talk about, is the intense collaboration between public health experts and advocates, whether they're human rights advocates, lawyers, policymakers in some cases, and governors, is so important, because then you are really saying there's a reason for that scientifically, or for medical reasons. You need to do certain things. And in the context of prison, imprisonment, detention, whether it's immigration detention and prison detention, and the effort to decarcerate and to get as many people out of prison, these were essential declarations and statements that were made to the courts that allowed the judges to examine the cases and to agree. And it also led to many states and localities to take their own initiatives, governors and others who said, we have to make sure that we get as many people out, because we can't keep them inside those cramped, crowded spaces because they will end up being infecting other people who are protecting them, and then the whole society will be losing. So there's also a zero-sum game that I think that we have shifted here, where we are all in this together, and protecting human rights for all is an essential. And I think it's also a part that we haven't seen before, where people are paying attention to this, because it's all of a sudden seeing that, oh my God, if I don't protect the people who are in this prison that is in our jurisdiction, it could actually hurt me. And we're seeing that in a lot of other contexts, in the healthcare context, people who are living in poverty, people who are living in homelessness, experiencing homelessness, how if we don't take care of everybody in our society, ultimately that will not be helping us in fighting this pandemic. And I think we get to that later on in the conversation about what are the lessons learned out of this, and how do we center human rights so that the protection of everyone is essential for the protection of all society. There's no one is really immune from this, and there's no one that can be above that sort of. This virus is really not discriminating, but really our laws, our practices, our ways of allocating resources, our way of treating people because of certain things are the ones that are making the discrimination and the disparities, and particularly the racial disparities we're seeing in the United States in terms of the mortality rate and the access to healthcare. That's a central piece that I hope that we will be able to learn something and finally fix that in the future.
And what's interesting, Jamil, is that the indivisibility of rights, if never it has been evident, economic and social cultural rights, civil and political rights, we can see that they are absolutely intertwined in this moment. Poverty itself is an underlying condition, and that the violation of the rights of people to have an adequate standard of living, which is specifically codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various treaties. This is something that in the, certainly in the last 40 years, with the rise of sort of neoliberal economics and austerity programming, et cetera, has absolutely gone in the wrong direction in terms of respecting human rights and putting the human well-being at the center. And I think what you're pointing to, Jamil, is very important, that the potential for collaboration between the health community and the human rights community is very rich right now, because we can see that physical health is very much tied to political health and social health. And this is an opportunity that we have. Hadar, you had a point you wanted to make.
Well, just building off of that, I mean, I think it is really interesting. And again, we'll probably talk later, the whole universal basic income debate, where, the United States is sending out checks of $1,200 to people to help them through, or to certain people to help them through this period. The Minister of Economics, I think in Spain, has just said that they plan to move forward with a universal basic income scheme in Spain,
right,
coming out of this. But it's also really important to note something that we probably take for granted, but it's important to say anyway, that this pandemic is not a great equalizer. It may be something that each of us as human beings and biological beings are all susceptible to, and it makes clear our shared vulnerability as human beings, but it has a disproportionate impact on already vulnerable people. And so it's exposing fissures in our society, which are continuing to expand. And as we go back to normal, whatever the new normal is going to be when we come out of this, for many, it's going to be going back to situations of suffering that, as Jamil said, existed before this started, and a real struggle for existence as they come out of this. So as we approach thinking about the human rights implications of this moment that we're in right now and ways in which to protect human rights, again, we have to be proactive in what we're thinking about in terms of how we're impacting and protecting the most vulnerable people who are being disproportionately affected, whether it is the poor, whether it is communities of color who have been in the United States hit in a wildly disproportionate way in terms of being far more susceptible and dying at higher rates than others.
Did I hear that in the state of Illinois, something like 70% of fatalities are African Americans?
And in Boston and in Michigan.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
it's all over. It's just starting to come out now in terms of.
There's an audience question that is right to this. So I wasn't going to go to questions yet, but this is very pertinent to this and want to engage our audience. Our audience question is, my question is about enforcing shelter-in-place laws. In some counties in Georgia, there have been recent policies put in place for violators of shelter-in-place. But these laws can inherently impact low-income people of color disproportionately more than others. They wouldn't be able to pay fines, related fines, and end up in prison. And the problems that arise from that cycle. How can we avoid these laws from impacting people of color negatively? Do you each want to take that? Jamil, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that's actually a good example of even existing laws and policies that we see, where it's a neutral on their face, but the way they are impacting people, who are enforced being disproportionate impact on people, particularly communities of color, poor people in different contexts, right? So this is a good example to see how you can't really expect that all people are in the same level of income and ability to protect themselves from this as part of this pandemic. You have to make sure that all those people who are going to should be protected are given the resources and the support that they need. And I think that's how basically measure or do kind of the a quick human rights impact assessment that we often don't do in any overall policy, just like you do in a time when you do environmental impact assessment. We have to do human rights impact assessment and racial disparities impact assessment. On when you're going to put in place a particular action or measure or law or policy, how does that impact people's rights, right, in a different ways? And that would give you another filter to make sure that you are addressing that. So people don't have the income, you'll be able to provide that sort of support in order to make sure that they are in the same level. And that obviously will not erase institutional racism or discrimination, but at least will give them the resources to be able to cope with this. So the same thing that we're seeing now with the policing. If you're seeing what we're calling on police departments to do is not to do the same kind of policing practices, including the racial profiling and other things, meaning they have to make sure that they don't put more people in those situations of detention. There are other less restrictive measures that they can take in order to warn people, make people aware of the situation without having to resort into the more drastic measures of fining people and even detaining them and exacerbating the problem. So those are all going to be decisions made at the very local level sometimes. Even if the federal government, unfortunately, the federal government is not doing their job and responsibility to provide this support. And we've seen from misinformation and calling the pandemic a hoax and trying to downplay its impact and just using it as a political way. We're seeing that what is happening is the protections and the actions happening on the state and local level, where they are taking more seriously their obligations towards the most vulnerable in our society. And that I think there's a way to use that moment in order to make sure that even when you're doing the right thing, you may be doing it for good intentions, but the implications could be devastating for certain parts of the community. For people with disabilities, if you're not thinking about that, for people with low income, or people with pre-existing medical conditions, people who are experiencing homelessness, and you can't tell them, oh, stay sheltered in place. We don't have any shelter to go to. So there's all things that you draw. You can't just have one thing that one size fits all, and you expect that people will comply and will be able to do that. You have to provide the necessary support systems that will make sure that all are going to be able to comply. The same with the school system. If you're closing school system without making sure that people are actually able to get access to those meals that for particularly poor children, you are denying people the right to get access to minimum thing like food, which is happening in our localities where they are continuing to operate the food delivery even when the schools are closed, right? Similarly with access to quality education, you can't assume that you're closing schools, you turn everything online, and everybody will have the same access to internet, have same access to devices that will be allow. Most people don't have those devices in their homes, and they don't have the internet access and so forth. So all of these disparities come to light, and I think that this is a time to press more for closing those gaps for the short term. And I think what we need to do is to think a long term. How do we make sure that the extra additional measures and laws are really protecting everyone, not just in a time of pandemic, but in a time of normalcy? So
that's a good transition. Hadar, do you want to address that and then transition us to sort of what world do we want to see? What's the moment we're in? What can we do to do what Jamil is pointing to, which is use this moment to take some transformational steps?
Sure. I mean, Jamil took my big rant, some of my big rants, and very articulately, laid all of those rants out. But I do want to add one more important rant in, which is when we look at all of these different structural challenges and failures, really, and the disparate impact and the disproportionate impact of the different policies that are being played out, in addition to what he very articulately went over, I think we have to make sure that we're also talking about the increasing and horrific incidents of gender-based violence that we're seeing. And it's domestic violence all over the world, actually. It's something that is always hard to measure, but as people have to shelter in place and they are in abusive environments and they have no place to go, shelters are full. There's no place for them to seek refuge. They can't even go to other people's houses. I think that it's really important for us to note that as well as one of the almost hidden impacts of what's going on today as well.
Can I, before you move on, can I comment
Absolutely.
on that? I was listening yesterday to a program on NPR about this, and the legal aid organizations are trying very much to get some focus on what can be done to protect victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. And what they're saying is that, of course, and I think we're facing this throughout the community of the human rights community, is that there is this sense of emergency that has to do with food, that has to do with medical services, et cetera. And the legal services are down the list somewhere. It's not a priority. And so you don't see funding, for example, coming into the legal aid divisions. So I'm glad you mentioned that. We have to actually, I've been hearing horror stories. The UN Secretary General has specifically pointed out this danger of the rise of domestic violence. So there's sexual violence, domestic violence against women. There's also domestic violence against children. So thank you for raising that. Let's, and then go on with the rest of what you were thinking, but let's keep that front and center as we think about what we should be doing next.
Sure. I mean, one thing, we haven't talked about a lot of issues, right?
Yeah.
There are issues in terms of, where the court systems are today. Many court systems have just stopped operating. And so where does due process stand? We haven't talked a lot about the normalization of what is really truly abnormal, and the fear. And I guess this moves into the transformative pieces of, Jamil and Karin, you and I have worked together for a long time, and in the post 9/11, immediate post 9/11 era, where we were all very concerned about kind of power grabs and emergency orders and the need to sunset a lot of these abnormal provisions, which really have become very normalized and are things that we take for granted in many ways in this country and around the world. As I said in the beginning, there's a public health emergency, but there's also an emergency and pandemic related to these states of emergency and this emergency thinking. And so how do we move that? I think about it, human rights is based on hope. And it's based on really moving aspirationally into the world that we want to see, what the world can be and what it should be. So we're at a unique moment right now to embrace reinvention on some levels, both on the systemic level, but also, as many of us have been at home, grappling with our children and our partners and who we want to be at this moment. Some of us have had the luxury to do some of that thinking. So I think about it again in terms of the sort of defensive side and the proactive side. However we come out of this, for all of the things that we're seeing right now in terms of rent freezes and eviction freezes in some places, some people being released from incarceration and conditions of confinement, some positive things that are happening, we're in for a great fall the moment that things reopen again. So we're going to see mass evictions. We're going to have to grapple with this massive unemployment. There were just figures released in the United States this morning talking about the fact that all of the gains in employment that had been made since 2008, since the recession, have now been erased in the span of 4 weeks completely. Food insecurity, the educational system. Jamil took my rant about the educational system and how we're going to rebuild that. But on the proactive side, we're kind of like in a cocoon right now, where we're transforming from the caterpillar into what could be the butterfly, or maybe it's going to be a moth. I'm not sure which, but we have this moment to be able to think about it. So we've acknowledged the clear interdependence of rights. And I think we also have to acknowledge some degree of global interdependence, whether it is in terms of travel or supply chains or communication or even discussions and learning from each other. And yet there are real tensions there too, because yesterday, even Mawiri, who's an activist in Zimbabwe, was talking about the fact that no one's paying attention to what's going on in Zimbabwe anymore. And so those countries that might have interceded where the government is doing its worst things are paying attention to their own backyards right now and aren't really looking at the bad acts that are being taken by different kinds of governments. Okay, so enough of that rant, but how do we think about what comes next? Yeah, go ahead, Jamil.
No, I just wanted to add about you raised a good question about interconnected, I think this pandemic, created this reality where we are all in this together, but the importance of working globally and transnationally together, and the fact that there's no such a thing as America first or my country first, my nation first. In a way, there's really that's some of the things that we're seeing where WHO, the World Health Organization, being punished for doing what is important, essential work. I think that sort of attacks on multilateral cooperation, which is an essential part of protecting human rights. Without that sort of system, we would not be good. And then the one other thing that you mentioned, but I think we need to stress it, put it out there, is the role of the government. The role of the government is so essential. A lot of people say, well, the government should not be providing this and that and this and that. But essentially, if you look at who is really doing the job now of responsibility, is saving lives, right, and protecting people and providing that sort of science-based, public health experts-based approaches to the pandemic, is the government-run operations. In addition to, of course, a lot of the systems that are in place because of that. Without that, we will be losing so much. And we can't just say, the government doesn't have any role in this. And so I think we need to make sure that we center the obligations, the human rights obligations of states, and then the responsibilities of other actors, businesses and corporations and non-state actors do have a role to play, for sure. We don't want to absolve anyone of their responsibility. I think more than anything, the role of the state and the role of the government, in particular protecting the most vulnerable among us, is so essential in this current reality.
And before you go on, Hadar, let's not forget that the political project of one of the political parties in this country for the last 35, 40 years has been to dismantle government.
Right.
And to defund. This current administration defunded the pandemics office, for example, and that what you're saying, Jamil, that the neoliberal project of the last 30, 40 years, we must be honest, has failed too many people. You can point to some advantages, lifting people out of poverty in certain ways, et cetera, and I'm not going to dismiss those. But the dismantling of the state and the state's obligation to certain functions, I think that has to return front and center. I just want to make that point, but go to you, Hadar.
No, but I'll tell you, I think that's one of the most interesting conversations here, right? And if you put it within the framework of human rights obligations and sort of this reconceptualization of what we want the world to be, well, it's interesting to note that the government has actually stepped in to provide some basic economic safety nets in terms of checks that are going out to people through social security accounts, right? Which is like a form of universal basic income for at least a short period of time here in the United States. The food assistance that is being provided to children in need through public school systems continues and is expanded in some ways, sometimes through a public-private partnership, but mostly through government action. The healthcare system and support for healthcare is obviously front and center, and the ability to talk about universal healthcare in a completely different way today, as opposed to 5 weeks ago, has suddenly opened up. Even this paycheck protection program that the government has opened up to enable organizations, small organizations, nonprofit organizations, as well as companies, to protect their workers, is a form of government assistance that you certainly would never have imagined this administration or their predecessors talking about as anything credible and what they would want to do. And so it's stunning to kind of see this moment of urgency focusing attention on those things. I think we need to draw those out, because those are the basis and the basics of what could be a real transformational moment. One other thing that I just wanted to add, because I think it's important to think about, and I appreciate very much what Jamil said about transnational organizing. It's not just transnational organizing, it's trans-silo organizing, it's trans-social movement organizing. This is a moment for organizing. And it's an interesting moment, because in some ways, the entire country has mobilized in the last 4 weeks. We've mobilized to stay home. And as we've mobilized to stay home, we can see the power of what action can take, what power action has. In this format, it's been that we're staying home. But what if we were to move that into actual action coming out of this, political action, mobilizing political power around a human rights agenda based on those things we just talked about as fundamental roles of government? Wow.
That continues, by the way. The action,
yeah, absolutely.
Even for people who are at home, sheltering at home and protecting themselves. What is amazing is that how many action driven by the internet, using the phones, calling on the government, putting pressure on governments, even though we are not able to gather outside and to organize then protect right to protest and assembly. The one fundamental thing to keep in mind is that doesn't, the fact that there's an emergency doesn't eliminate, completely erase the right to assemble, the right to protest and expression of
and in fact, I think the people who, those who are promoting universal healthcare, Medicare for all, et cetera, are generating petitions, are organizing online to pressure the presumptive Democratic nominee to adopt a more robust universal health plan than he has so far done. This is happening online. So this is, I absolutely agree. I think, and it doesn't need to be partisan. We need to be putting pressure on all of our elected leaders. Go ahead, Hadar.
No, but I was also going to say, first of all, there are many countries, again, as Jamil said earlier, where, the right to assembly has never been robust. And so folks have had to organize online in lots of different ways, right? I was on a call yesterday with some folks from Hong Kong who said, this is actually a great moment for us, because we've been able to kind of sit back, reorganize and reassess and be able to move forward. The same is true in Lebanon, where there were very robust social protests going on. And now everyone's at home and regrouping and getting ready for whatever the next move is. But that's not to say that they're not organizing and moving now. There's so much organizing going on. And so
let's, because we only have a few more minutes, let's put a fine point on that. Okay, wait, there's a question from the audience. I want to get to it. It's been suggested that we have to keep our elected officials accountable right now and push them to ensure the rights of individuals are not violated, primarily individuals of marginalized groups. But right now, phones are not being answered in their offices and emails are not being read. How can we best make sure that our voices are heard by our elected officials so that they can take the necessary actions given these conditions? Do either of you know of any ways that people are grouping together in this way?
Well, I think that even if they're not answering their phones and their congressional offices or their offices in the state, local level, today you can engage and pressure them over social media.
Right. Tweet at them.
Thanks to court decisions and our sister organization, the First Amendment organization, the night at the Columbia University challenged the practice of blocking people on Twitter, and now government officials are not allowed to block people on Twitter. So you'll be able to go to their Facebook page, they're going to be able to go to their Twitter account, they're going to be able to really make that noise, even if it's not as impactful as being out there outside their offices, or go to their offices or call them directly. But believe me, those matter, those actions matter. So there are a lot of different ways of people thinking. And in some places, people were, taking actions even outside if they are able to move around while watching and maintaining social distancing. Some actions that shouldn't be completely, barred, and there'd be people moving in their cars to protest particular things. I think we need to make sure that some of these things continue to be protected, and not to shut down all kinds of protests, whether it's offline or online. Making sure that it's, again, the main important thing is public safety, public health as a first priority, right? So I think there's a lot of ways that people are doing that online and offline in a very creative way to make sure that they hear the protest and act in a particular way.
Hadar, we only have a few more minutes, so do you want to help
But I
us?
also do want to note that right now, I mean, tonight, actually, there's a statement being issued that the state of North Carolina has said that protesting is not an essential action. And so there are movements also on a state-based level to try to restrict any kind of social distancing, appropriate, law-abiding protests outside. Tweeting is really important. Protecting that right to assemble in safe ways is really important. And robust journalism is very important. Making sure that these stories get told and are amplified.
Okay, so we only have a few more minutes. I think what I'm hearing is the importance of, one thing that I have in mind, what you mentioned, Hadar, about Zimbabwe. I think people are struggling on a very local level now. The transnational aspect of this is very important, and maybe we can use this platform to link people up who are struggling locally, to connect people globally, because we don't want to forget what's happening in really difficult situations where things are dire. But I also want to acknowledge and remember that the struggle in this country, when I see what happened in Wisconsin to voter rights, where something like only 9 polling places were opened in the city of Milwaukee for thousands and thousands of voters, and the brave people who went out and voted. This is a form of struggle. I don't want to see any martyrs for the cause of democracy in this country, people who die just to exercise their right to vote. This is very real here in this country as much as anywhere else. So is the UN are the UN special rapporteurs, is the UN Human Rights Council doing anything to measure? I liked this idea of a human rights impact assessment, Jamil. Maybe we need to expect human rights impact assessments of the pandemic, really community by community, and support and help and encourage local activists and movements to do human rights impact assessments in their community. Maybe that's one of the best things that we can point to. Any concluding comments? We only have 2 minutes. I just want to, while you're thinking about your concluding sentence, make an announcement that on April 30th, I hope that our audience will participate in another roundtable like this, where we will delve deeply into a very specific country context in Colombia, where the community of San Jose de Apartado will be sending a representative onto a Zoom call like this, onto a online discussion, to talk about the self-protection mechanism that community has set up over the many years of civil war. We're going to be looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on protection of social leaders in Colombia, where hundreds, really it's the most dire situation anywhere in the world where human rights defenders and social leaders have been assassinated and killed. Hundreds and hundreds in the last few years. So that's April 30th at noon. Please join us for that. So Jamil, if you want to give us your concluding thoughts for about a minute, and then we'll turn it over to Hadar to give us her concluding thoughts.
Sure. I think that the silver lining maybe in this tragedy and this devastation that we're seeing around the pandemic is really the seeing those invisible communities and the lack of centering human rights and what it could cause and what is the real cost for society and for the world indeed when we don't take that seriously. So I think that we should be centering human rights and centering all people's rights. No one should be left behind, and doing it with the idea that people are, and different countries have different capacities, and there's not going to be the same, but we have to keep pushing for making sure that emergency powers are not outlast the public health crisis, that we are holding accountable those actors, no matter where they operate, in what system, whether democratic or not, maintaining a multilateral system where we can be able to protect and defend and shed light on those who are most likely to be impacted long term, and think creatively about structural changes and solutions. That when we see the pandemic, now we can always say, look, you were able to release those people. You were able to do those things in a time of pandemic. There's no reason. We can really use some of the tragic situation in a way that we can move forward and center human rights of all people. And I feel like this is look at this, just a final sentence. It's like you could have the most powerful military and economy in the world, and yet those are not going to protect you from such a threat. And who is going to protect you? Are those who are on the front line that are not paid well, they're denied benefits, they're denied protection. And I think that's a really good lesson for the United States and for the world in terms of what it means. What is that extreme capitalism or capitalism as a whole make people go through, and why we need to fix this in order for us all to enjoy our human rights.
Thank you, Jamil. That was wonderful. Hadar.
What he said, absolutely what he said. This has given us a moment and an opportunity to look at what and who is most important in our society. And as Jamil just said, the people in the United States who have become the most important people are the supermarket clerks, are the janitors, are the delivery people, are the gig economy workers who have no protections. The actions that the government is taking are based on values of safety net and the relationship between individuals and government in terms of basic income, in terms of supporting for schools and food, things that have been vilified by some people over time. And so we have a moment and opportunity right now to really re-envision and to build off of these openings, to value the people who have historically been undervalued, to look at where the disproportionate impact is on vulnerable communities, and to re-envision government to truly support human rights and to support that relationship between the individual and government in a way that allows us to really respect, protect, and fulfill all basic human rights for all individuals.
Well, that is an excellent way to end our discussion. Thank you to Hadar Harris and Jamil Dakwar. Stay tuned on this channel for more programs like this. April 30th, we'll be hearing from our colleagues at the Washington office on Latin America and San Jose de Apartado. We'll also have a member of Mark Pocan, Congressional Representative Mark Pocan will be one of his Columbia staff, national security staff will be joining that discussion. We'll be looking deeply into the situation in Colombia. So join us on that day and for future programs. Thank you for joining us, and have a safe and productive time in isolation. And we'll see you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Karin.
Bye-bye. Jason?